Good morning, everybody. Welcome to WeCanBeZero, a conversation with Joan Collins TD, the leader of Righttochange. My name is Jason, and I'm a volunteer from WeCanBeZero. This morning I'm going to be chatting with Joan Collins TD, the leader of Righttochange. Should be joining us in just a moment. Good morning, Joan. I hope you can hear me okay.
How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. Thanks for joining our Facebook Live event this morning with the WeCanBeZero campaign. So I suppose just to give an introduction there to anyone who's watching, I've already introduced myself. My name is Jason. I'm a volunteer with WeCanBeZero. And the WeCanBeZero campaign is affiliated with the Independent Scientific and Advocacy Group. And I'd like to welcome Joan Collins. She's very welcome, TD and the leader of the Righttochange political party there this morning. I suppose, and we'll crack on very quickly. And look, I suppose just to paint the picture here, I suppose, Joan, Righttochange was born, I think, out of one of the most successful social and protest movements in the history of the Irish state, and a huge element of that movement was peaceful protest. And I suppose in times like this, there are lots of different events. We've seen reports in the media a few weeks ago about large mass gatherings. But I suppose in times like these, how do you think people can protest safely but also effectively?
It is a big civil rights issue to a certain degree, because people have got the democratic right to protest, but we are in a pandemic, and that public health has to be key priority. I think you can have protests if it's organised properly, and if groups liaison with the Gardaí, obviously, and let them know what they're doing. But if you could protest, say, all down O'Connell Street, 2 meters apart, or along the quays or something like that, 2 meters apart, with your protest placards and that, I think that'd be a fairly effective protest. But then you'd have to be within your 5 kilometres and all that. That would come into it too, But yeah, it is difficult to protest, and I think, from the point of view, we can't pick and choose who can protest and who can't protest, because this has been a big issue, I think, in relation to the anti-vaxxers and people like that. They have a right to protest as well, but they have a right to protest in a public health manner, not going around with no masks and mingling together closely and all that type of thing. So I think it is a debate that has ramifications on protest.
And I suppose, with the backdrop of the activity we've seen in the last few weeks, there is an onus on anyone who wants to, protest, or if you want to call it the right to peaceful assembly. But there is an onus on all of us to I suppose do it in a safe way, because we have a responsibility to each other, don't we?
Absolutely. And when the contradictions are huge, we had a situation there on Tuesday night where scabs came into Debenhams and Blanchardstown to remove assets from the shop. Now, whether that should be allowed in level 5 is questionable. And the protesters were peacefully protesting. They were sitting on the ground in distances, wearing masks, and they were removed by the guards, and the scabs were allowed into Debenhams to remove the stock. So everywhere there's contradictions, but those workers had the right to protest, and they had the right to protest with respect to their fellow human beings, as you said, and keeping your distance, wearing masks, etc.
Absolutely. And just moving on to my next question, I suppose, I suppose in the times that we're living in, how can members of the public, and even anyone who would want to try and, I suppose, advocate for the government to change their minds and to change strategy, because we've seen in terms of managing the pandemic, and we've seen, I mean, we're calling for a zero COVID approach. And again, when we say zero COVID, we don't mean to get to zero. We mean zero mystery cases. So the idea is to get the case numbers down so low, so that our public health teams can manage them effectively. But how can members of the public help people like you, and help TDs like you to change their minds? How can people partner almost with you to help you advocate for them to change their minds? And I suppose I would I suppose one of the quotes that I saw during the week was from Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, and I suppose this kind of frames the whole way we think about the pandemic and how best we manage it. But what she said was, I didn't worry that elimination might prove impossible. Even if New Zealand didn't get there, it would still save lives. The alternative is to set a lesser goal and still misfire. And I suppose, why are we tolerating 4,000 plus people dying?
Yeah, that's a very serious question, Jason. The first question was how the people can help TDs, like ourselves. Listen, every day of the week, the government are being lobbied by, certain sectors in society, and they would be the retail, they'd be construction, all these big lobbyists. But the biggest lobby is the people. So if the people did the same type of thing, email the TDs, ring their constituency offices, and lobbied for it in a very strong way that WeCanBeZero could be actually manifested, I think there'd be huge pressure on the government to do it. Because we've seen that in the mother and baby homes issue, and when they were trying to bring in that legislation, and the amount of people who inundated TDs and calling for that not to happen, for their records to be hidden for 25 years.
Yes.
And that pushed the government back on that. So people's lobbying can and does work to a certain degree. So I think it's a simple message coming from a huge group of people will have an impact on the thinking of government.
Okay. So everyone get their phones at the ready, get their email, get their keyboards out.
I think uplifting those organizations like that are very effective in, if they take on a message, and that's what happened in the mother and baby homes. They took on the message, and then people got at the back of that and lobby their TDs and their public reps. So I think something like that, if that could be possible, would be very effective.
Yeah. We saw the other day, during the week, Micheál Martin, presenting the new plan. I think it was either Tuesday or Wednesday there, but he said something that I suppose left me scratching my head a little bit. And I'm going to just read out the first bit of what he said. And this is a direct quote, where he said, what he said was, "The disease we are dealing with now is a very different beast to that which we were facing at the beginning of the first lockdown in Ireland more than 54 weeks ago." And he goes on to say, "The so-called UK or B117 variant is essentially a new virus. It is more transmissible and it is significantly more dangerous. And the reality of the B117 variant is that if it is given any space at all, it spreads very quickly and the consequences are terrible. All across Europe now, it is causing very serious difficulties in yet another surge." And yet, when you read that and when you process that, and then when you think about what's happening in a week or 10 days time, where all schools are going back, secondary school pupils are going to be going into classrooms, and we have a situation where the government changed their, I think their priority. So they're vaccinating by age now, as opposed to maybe your occupation and how many people you'd be coming across on a daily basis. Is that not a very contradictory action to those words read out by the Taoiseach?
Absolutely. It's full of contradictions. I think that's why the certain amount of people have lost trust in the government and its messaging and its actions. You know, at the beginning of January, when they brought in this major lockdown, it should have been very clear that it had to be the same type of restrictions as last March in 2020, but it wasn't. The amount of essential work, essential industry was expanded. You know, I have double the amount of workers going into the workplace than we had last year.
Yes.
We've had Leffel calling for the closure of the, not the closure, the mandatory hotel quarantine since last year. The government didn't take that on board, again, because of lobbying. And we're now seeing that 3 people to date had COVID that are in the mandatory hotel quarantine. So it has done its job already from the point of view of the restricted countries that are on the list.
Yes.
And now we heard this morning that there's a new variant in France that, and I'm not a scientist, so I don't really, I can't really comment on them, but
nor am I.
the genome sequence is even very different than the sequences that we have now and the variants that we know now, the B117, the South African, the Brazilian one. So they're saying it's very serious. So yes, we're going to have to keep an eye on that. So how Simon Coveney could turn around and say that St. Lucia or whatever, we shouldn't let anybody in from there unless they do hotel quarantine. But in France, where there's mutations happening and there's been something like 50,000 infections in the last couple of days.
Yes.
That's not a threat to bringing in a new variant into the country. It's just beyond me. I can't logically, I can't logically make out how they think that way.
Yes, absolutely.
Public health is public health. The variant doesn't care whether you're Irish or French or, whatever nationality you are. It just wants to keep on multiplying, and it'll do so the most effective way it can.
Yeah.
So it just beggars belief.
And what, and that, I suppose, like, what, I saw that myself during the week, where it's reported in the media that Simon Coveney was, the Minister for Foreign Affairs, was resistant to adding Italy, Germany and France to the list. I mean, can that thinking at all be explained?
I don't think so. The only way it can be explained is that they're getting pressure from Europe not to do it. But to my mind, and the US it was included in that, the US have had stop flights coming in from Europe for a good while now. Yet it's not okay for a country like Ireland to decide you have to do mandatory hotel and quarantine, The logic beggars belief. It just beggars belief. And NEFID have advised that those countries go on to the mandatory hotel quarantine.
Yeah, and it just, I suppose, if you wanted to flip it, and we've heard over the years that Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are supposedly the party of enterprise and jobs and employment, but the risks of bringing a variant into the country, is that not anti-jobs, anti-enterprise, anti-employment? Because what will end up happening is, if that variant comes into the country, or another variant or a strain from another part of the world, essentially we're going to be anti-enterprise. We're going to be shutting down businesses, and that leads to potential job losses. So it really is so counterproductive and contradictory, isn't it?
Absolutely. And as I said, in January, when we had this restrictions brought in, I think people were ready and were up for having a strict lockdown and getting, bringing it down as much as possible. As you said, you never have zero, but it's zero in the community, and that we have to be working towards. But and most businesses know that they can't go in and out and yo-yo and in and out of closures and open up again. But again, I think it comes down to whole layers of society sort of looking at the government and saying, what you're doing doesn't make sense. Now you have businesses calling, once you have one business calling for it, they've been the safest industry in the world for COVID, like, you know. We've had a construction sector saying that they're the safest, then somebody else come out and say they're the safest. It's not about whether they're the safest environments. It's a question of people moving around in society and passing the virus on very easily. And then guards been let down on that. And, you know, it would have been much more effective if the government had brought in a firm, clear message in January and said, if we stick to this, we will get it down within a period of time, a shorter lockdown, harder lockdown. And people would have gone along with it. I think people would have said, yes, okay, we'll stick with that. But when things start getting messy, mixed messaging going out, that's when people start to lose heart, you know, and even businesses lose heart, because then they're saying, I want to get on that bandwagon. I'm not going to be left behind.
Yeah. And I suppose just thinking about that statement from the Taoiseach the other day, I suppose, and just looking back even last year and right up to now, when we have all these, after Easter, we're going to have a movement of close to 1 million children, young children and teenagers right up to leaving certificate. And I suppose, you know, when you look around Europe, lots of European countries have their school-going kids wearing masks. Now, why do you think we're so reluctant or so far behind when it comes to kids wearing masks in school?
Again, Jason, I think it's a mindset of some people at the top echelons of society. It took a long time for the call for mask wearing, even in shops and that. And you know, we were way behind other parts of Europe. And it just seems to be, but I do understand that you have to bring people with you as well. It was a very, very new thing to Irish people, was the concept of putting on a mask. So it did have to be, you know, explained why you should be wearing this and the reasons behind it, you know. Once people understand what I've been asked to do, if somebody explains it to me and said, this is the reason why you must wear a mask, to protect other people, and you know the importance of that. Well, then I could see people starting to wear it even before the call came out that people have to wear it in retail. And I think it's the same here with children and people. Government are just afraid to move ahead of people to a certain degree, but I know there's different arguments as well. I have a family member that's over in France doing teaching in primary school, where she says the kids are nearly eating the masks. You know, they stuck in them and they're taking them off and putting them on again. And some people say that that's more dangerous than them not wearing a mask. But you know, in most European countries, the number of children per classroom is much less than in Ireland as well. Like so, but I mean, I've seen plenty of young children around wearing masks. You know, 5 and 6 year olds, when they're coming up to meet their grannies and all that, they're all wearing the cloth mask. So it's not beyond the realms of.
Yeah, and I just touching on what you said there about the classroom sizes. I mean, we were locked down from March, effectively March to September. Kids were locked out of school, if you want to say that. And then we were, from before Christmas right up until a couple of weeks ago there, all kids were locked out of school. And one of the things that I noticed was there wasn't really a whole lot changed about schools. You know, the format, how we do school, you know, kids go back into the same size classrooms. They weren't really, you know, there was no ventilation put in there. There was no CO2 monitoring. You know, even reimagining what school would look like. For example, you know, giving people choices to homeschool, or even, you know, temporarily taking over empty buildings bigger buildings so that you could adequately space children out. I mean, like doing everything that we possibly can to minimize risks, not just for children, but for children and teachers, but for wider society. Because what happens is, and this is what I would feel anyway, I don't know what you would think, but is if in the next few weeks, there is a big risk that this is going to become a problem again with case numbers going up. And because of the inaction by government over from Christmas up until March, it seems to me there was no imagination, you know, in the government with regards to reinventing what classrooms would look like to minimize the risk. Because if you're minimizing the risk, at least you're doing everything you can so that it doesn't become a problem for wider society. And isn't that a huge failing on government?
I agree. We were told a number of things back last March, and we were told, you know, that the restrictions and the lockdown was to, protect the health system. In that period of time from the summer, we could have been building extensions onto hospitals, doing things differently. We know the convention centre has been used for people who have illness, you know, the illness and are not that bad to be in hospital and all that. But reimagining it, yeah, I just this morning actually, or was last night, was a report that some school had to close down in the Midlands, I think it was, and they're now using a big room in the in a racing oh gosh, what's the name of it? I can't remember the name of it. But they reimagined it and brought their school kids out and are using huge rooms in that complex.
Okay.
And you know, so that could have been done in an awful lot of schools, even if they brought half the children back in, primary school kids back in for 1 week, and then the other kids being at home, maybe doing homeschooling or something like that, and then the next week change it around so that you have less numbers in the schools, and just to make sure that the kids still have school and still have that avenue to go into, and that their homeschooling and their education has not been broken. Things like that, I think, haven't been looked at enough, you know. And obviously the ventilation, I just think it's mad.
But isn't it an awful position, though? Isn't it an awful position to put children in, especially when I think about older children who might be more prone to anxiety and whose mums and dads and uncles and aunts and grannies and granddads who might have underlying medical conditions, you know, and the you know, children and teenagers and young people facing into leaving certificates and things like this, to have the worry now that they have to attend class, but they might bring something home that could lead to, as Micheál Martin said, terrible, terrible consequences.
Well, I listened to another an interview there yesterday of a 17-year-old boy who's doing his leaving cert, who's a carer for his mum, and he was so anxious that he'd bring something home to his mother because she was a cancer patient.
Yes.
And very vulnerable. So he was really very, very anxious. Number one, going to school, and then what he could pick up there. He doesn't know, you're mixing with people. And if he brought it home to his mum, that he could be the catalyst for her getting very ill, you know. So there is a lot of anxiety among that age level, because they're obviously more aware of
absolutely
the impact it have on their family and that. But isn't that the case for WeCanBeZero? You know, that if we did it properly, we wouldn't have to be worrying about these things, and we had a proper track and trace and the public health teams and all that type of thing.
Absolutely. And that brings me on to my last question here is, we know our public health teams and our public consultants are struggling. We know that they don't have enough resources to do their jobs. They don't have enough staff. They don't even have the technology. You know, we live in an advanced age of technology. And a year into a pandemic, they're using Excel sheets and pen and papers to try and track and trace and deal with outbreaks in the community. I mean, is it the case that is it the case that some of our politicians are? Is it money? Does it all come back to money here, that they just will not spend the money to resource these teams, and that people dying is just collateral damage?
Number one, Jason, the public health teams and doctors have really been the Cinderella of our health service for the last decades, to be quite honest. There's a report there going back to 2011, I think it is, even further back. I think I read it, and I just can't remember the exact year, called the Howarth report that that Scally, Dr. Scally, was part of the research on it, saying that the public health teams have to be resourced. They haven't even got the national director's position hasn't even been filled for the last nearly 3 years. And they should be made consultants, because they're trained up to that level of consultant anyway. So it's all part of the neoliberal agenda, as far as I'm concerned, up to the point of last year, to the pandemic. And now, because of the fact that they are trying to recruit people into the public health teams, there's no one wanting to join, because it's not recognised as being a consultant level. It's not. They haven't got the resources and teams around them like you'd have in Scotland and Australia. And I mean, our public health is only a third of what it is in Scotland, which is just madness. And it's just a whole lack of investment, not just in public health, even though they are at the Cinderella part of medicine, but throughout the whole health service. And then the hiving off of elderly care and all that to the private sector. And it's just, it has been a direction that's been going for the last 20 years. And I think that, from my point of view, as we come out of this, and hopefully we will be coming out of it with the vaccines and that, and we don't get a fourth wave, is that this is the key thing that people should be demanding from their governments, is to invest in our public health, and make them attractive, so that people don't feel they have to leave after getting an education here to other countries to get a good living, and then come back at some stage if they want to settle down and have families. So I'm hoping that this public health will be one of the main issues and demands from Irish society to actually fix.
Well, I can certainly say for myself, I have a more acute understanding of the importance now of public health. And I think anyone who's in business or in their private lives or any walk of life, if we do not adequately resource our public health teams, as climate change becomes a bigger issue moving forward, we are heading for trouble. Absolutely.
It's public health. I mean, I always knew public health was there, and that there, it was part of our health system. But it's in situations like this that you really realise how important they are, even though they have played key roles in other illnesses and diseases in the communities. But it has really highlighted the need to resource public health properly. And they have tried to recruit people into that over the last 3 months, because I've been sending in PQs all the time on it, but they're just not getting the response.
Brilliant. Well, listen, Joan, I just want to say thank you very much for joining our Facebook Live this morning, and happy Easter to you, and happy Easter to everyone who's watching.
Absolutely. Best wishes for the Easter. And listen, everybody, try and stay at home as much as you can. I know it's just it's so frustrating, but at this stage, if we all stay at home and look after ourselves, we'll be fine.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Joan. Happy Easter to you. Take care.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye.